Are you wondering where to find one of the largest collections of bronze statues in Tennessee? If so, then you are due for a trip to the Green McAdoo Cultural Center in Clinton, Tennessee, a historic museum detailing the events of the Clinton 12 and their desegregation of Clinton High School in 1956. Come visit us.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Cat Acree from BookPage, and I'm thrilled to be hosting tonight's Southern Festival of Books event with Becky Cooper for her book, We Keep the Dead Close, A Murder at Harvard and a Half Century of Silence. But before we get into that, I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Humanities Tennessee and go through a little bit of how this will work. There will be links in the chat to buy Becky's book from Parnassus Books, which helps to keep the festival free, but also, since her book does not publish until November, we will be giving away 10 advanced review copies randomly to those who are attending this session via the Attendify app, which is pretty exciting. I'd like to give a big thank you to our sponsors, Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. The festival is also supported in part by individuals, and there will be a donate button posted if you wish to contribute to keeping this incredible festival free. As Becky and I talk this evening, I invite you to submit your questions in the chat or on Facebook, either way. Keep in mind that the festival inclusion policy applies online as in person. With that out of the way, I'd love to introduce Becky Cooper, a former New Yorker editorial staff member who's going to blow your mind with We Keep the Dead Close, in which she investigates the then unsolved murder of Jane Britton, a Harvard graduate student of archaeology who was bludgeoned to death in her off-campus apartment in January 1969.
Hi, Kat, and thank you all for joining me tonight. I wanted to start off this evening. I know Kat and I are going to talk a lot, and hopefully you'll submit questions too, but I wanted to start by reading one of the early chapters of the book, which is the moment after general exams finish. And general exams are the kind of qualifying exams for people who are doing their PhD exams at Harvard. So I'll begin. The body. The general exams finished just after noon. As the students packed their bags, a few speculated on where Jane Britton might be. Jane was known for her morbid humor and for her disappearing spells. The kind of girl to blurt out in the middle of a perfectly happy get-together. Christ, the only reason I get up in the morning is because I hope a truck will run over me. She seemed to enjoy getting a rise out of people. Like the other time when, after an unexplained absence, she appeared in the Peabody smoking room and announced to those present, "The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated." People knew she was fundamentally a good student, one of the few who had gone directly from Radcliffe, Harvard's sister school, into Harvard's PhD program. Missing generals would have been out of the question. Jane's boyfriend, Jim Humphreys, had called her twice that morning before he left for the Peabody Museum. He was taking the exam that day too. Jim, 27, was a few years older than Jane, Canadian and 6'7", with sandy blonde hair parted to the side and horn-rimmed glasses. Jim looked more like an engineer or architect than the archaeologist he was training to be. He was a quiet person, reserved to the point of brooding, whose face wasn't expressive even at the best of times. He was known around the Peabody as the gentleman for doing old-fashioned courtly things like helping girls with their coats and writing thank you notes for dinner parties. Jane and Jim had met in the spring of 1968 during a seminar to prepare for a summer expedition in Iran. The site was called Tepeyaya, and the dig was led by a young Harvard professor named Clifford Charles Lamberg Karlofsky. Graduate students called him Carl, or CCLK, or, more covertly, Count Dracula. due to his rumored Eastern European aristocratic background, an air of mystery. The young professor was a rising star in the department and an emerging leader in Near Eastern archaeology. The success of the '68 season only enhanced this reputation. Not long after the expedition crew returned to the States, the Boston Globe hailed Lambert Karlofsky as the discoverer of what appeared to be Alexander the Great's lost city of Carmania. It was on this dig in southeastern Iran that Jane and Jim's relationship blossomed. They had a chance to feel for each other's loneliness, a fellow digger would later tell reporters. Recently, Jane had talked to her friends about the possibility of marriage. She liked to joke that it would be held at the Church of the Unwarranted Assumption. Jane hadn't answered either call, which Jim thought was odd, but he assumed she couldn't sleep and had gone over to her neighbor's place for breakfast. He had seen her the night before, and, other than being nervous about the test, she had seemed fine. But when she wasn't in the exam either, he knew something had gone wrong. She was sick or had slept in. He didn't let himself consider worse. After turning in their tests, a group of graduate students headed for lunch, and they invited him along. Jim politely declined and went outside and across the road to call Jane one more time. He didn't want to use the telephone in the museum because he knew everyone would be listening. Again, Jane didn't answer. Jim started the 15-minute walk from the museum to Jane's apartment, a 4-story walk-up, a short block past the square, on a side street that connected Mount Auburn Street to the Charles River, where John F. Kennedy Park would eventually sit, and where I first heard the story. Her address, 6 University Road, was one of 5 entrances to a red brick and limestone building known as the Craigie. It took up a full square block and was commissioned by Harvard in the late 1890s to provide a less expensive housing option for students. The suites were small, but the building was full of lovely touches: natural wood trim, a large courtyard, and corner bay windows. Over the years, however, particularly as Harvard's housing system developed and provided undergraduates with on-campus accommodations, the building had fallen into disrepair. The surrounding area had also deteriorated. It became a kind of no man's land of Harvard Square, home to parking lots, a trolley yard, and an alley that led to the river. Before developers turned those lots into the upscale Charles Hotel in the 80s, the only reason to walk to that part of town was the Mount Auburn post office across the street, and Cronin's, a watering hole with a small TV screen and cheap beers. But the rents were low. Jane's was $75 a month, and the building was centrally located, so it was still real estate coveted by graduate students, particularly in the anthropology department, where units were passed down from one generation to the next. Jane had secured her apartment thanks to her now next-door neighbors, Don and Jill Mitchell, who were students specializing in Pacific Island anthropology. Besides, Jane wasn't bothered by the building's shabbiness. While the Mitchells always used their deadbolt, Jane almost never locked her door. She seemed to live with a sense of invulnerability. Jim reached University Road around 12:30 p.m. He pushed in the front door and walked up the stairs, flooded by the gray winter sun from the skylight. The stairwell dead-ended at the 4th floor landing. The hallway walls were apple green and peeling. Jim walked past the Mitchell's place. Jane's, the smallest of the 3 apartments on the floor, was at the end of an alcove. It was unmistakable. Blue, green, and yellow polka dots decorated the left side of her hallway, and on her front door, which she had painted gold, was a piece of typewriter paper with a quote she had found amusing. Police would later remove the paper as evidence. "Maybe," said Mrs. Kiley, "she's an archaeologist because she didn't have a sandbox when she was little." September 1968. Jim knocked on Jane's door, even though he knew better than anyone that it would be unlocked, especially in the winter when the radiator heat made the wood swell and the lock finicky. Don and Jill Mitchell heard the noise and thought it might be Jane coming home from her exam. Don, whose thick mustache made him look much older than his 25 years, walked into the hallway. "Is Jane home?" Jim asked. "I guess so." "Well, she didn't take her quiz." Don's face changed. He encouraged Jim to go in and check, so Jim knocked on Jane's door again. No answer. This time Jim reached for the handle and gave it a shove, and it opened. "Can I come in?" Jim called out. Dawn waited by the door. Again, no answer. Jim felt a cold gust of air coming from the kitchen and saw that the window was wide open. He was certain it hadn't been open the night before. Jim reached his head back to look into the kitchen. There was no one there except Jane's pet Angora cat, Fuzzwort. Jane sometimes left the window open because she thought there was a gas leak in her kitchen, but she'd only do that when the Mitchells were looking after her cat. The screen had long ago rotted off, and Fuzzwort liked to run out into the fire escape. Jane's room was its usual homey mess. Books, ashtrays, manuscripts, cups, and cigarette butts. A turtle tank, soupy with algae, rested on her dresser. Shards of light glittered through the wine and brandy bottles she had arranged in her windows to catch the sun, a Dionysian pane of stained glass. Ceramic owls and artifacts from Jane's travels lined the shelves. Paintings, some of which Jane had done herself, hung in their frames. The walls were white, and on the one by the kitchen, she had painted cats, giraffes, and owls, capricious and dreamy. Their eyes filled the room. It was not until he fully walked into the apartment that he could see her. Jane's right leg hung over the side of her bed, which was a mattress on top of a simple box spring, placed directly on the floor. Her blue flannel nightgown was pulled up to her waist. He didn't try to shake her awake. He walked out of the room and asked Dawn to get Jill because he didn't think anything was seriously wrong, and Jane's state of undress made it seem more like, quote, a woman's job. Jill left her apartment, walked into Jane's, and came back out almost immediately. She needed to lie on her bed. She felt sick. Dawn walked in this time. He approached the bed and noticed, with a bolt of guilt, that Jane wasn't wearing underwear. Above her waist was a pile of long-haired sheepskin rugs and her fur coat. She was buried face down underneath. He walked closer and pulled back the coat until he could see the back of her head. There was blood on the sheets and the pillows and on the rugs and around her neck. He didn't turn her over. There was no question. She was dead.
Thanks, Becky. That is quite a note to end on, but also perfect because it just opens it up, and then from there you just run with it. I mean, this book just goes deeper and deeper and deeper, and so I kind of want to start this conversation by going more general. I want to ask you about the true crime industry. Or just true crime stories as a whole. It feels like right now we're in a time where true crime is maybe more self-aware than it has been in the past, more likely to comment on, maybe the problems with fetishizing serial killers, but also like we are starting to see more of the very human side of the sleuthing process. And that's what we're definitely getting here is like a mixture of memoir and true crime. We're getting a lot of your process in this investigation. So I just want to hear your thoughts on the true crime genre. What do you see as your role, and maybe how has it changed since you started working on this and where you are now?
Absolutely. I think when I started writing the book, I didn't necessarily even imagine it as a true crime book, which is sort of funny to think about. I think one of the reasons I ended up choosing the editor I did was because she understood that it was ritual and the characters in the book that grabbed me. And the book obviously is occasioned by the murder of this brilliant woman, Jane Britton. But for me, what I was interested in was the kind of afterlife of the murder and the ways in which the ripples of her death kind of permeated, and the ways in which we came to tell her story and came to learn how to find some kind of closure even when there was no resolution. And so, I think I just kind of set out to write the kind of book I would have wanted to read. That it was never genre first. I think in a lot of ways, looking back on the book, you'll see, and hopefully you do see that I've subverted a lot of the kind of cliches of the genre maybe, or I've encouraged a kind of self-reflexiveness where one of my favorite characters in the book reminds anthropologists to examine their own biases. And she says, it's hard to admit that you're part of the world that you're studying. And I think for me in the book, I've tried to have the same kind of self-reflexive nature for true crime itself, that as much as you're inhaling the story of her mystery at a certain clip, that I try never to allow it to tip over into entertainment. That I try always to remind myself and the readers of the complexity of her humanity, and of the intensity of the suffering of her community. And in some ways, I think the greatest subversion of the genre is that it's victim first. That, like, the book for me is a biography of Jane as much as it is a little bit of a kind of Bildungsroman of my having learned to become an investigative journalist in order to do her story justice. But it's not really about the person who killed her. That wasn't, to me, the most interesting part of her story. And so my role in it was just, I think, to explore her story as far as I could, because I think, when I started working on it, I first heard her story when I was a junior at Harvard. And by that point, her murder had gone unsolved for about 40 years. And it felt like, at first it felt like an open secret. And then it felt like I was too naive to think that I could solve something that the police hadn't been able to do. So I had to be able to find closure somewhere else. And so I think moving away from categorizing it as true crime into something more like cultural history or biography or memoir was a way that I thought that even if the crime wasn't solved, there could be satisfaction found in the book.
Yeah, that actually kind of perfectly answers what my follow-up question was going to be, is that sometimes when in true crime, we see these amateur investigators kind of try to insert their memoir into the story, but maybe not having not having a great reason to do so much as just trying to, like, create some intrigue, and it's probably because they haven't asked those questions that you clearly have. And I think that's why it works so well.
Thank you. I mean, I wanted as little of myself in the book as possible. I was going over my notes the other day from, like, I feel in some ways the writing process was this, like, 1.5 year long tunnel that I only in retrospect, having reconstructed it now, have any kind of insight into. But there was one little note that I wrote to a friend where I was worried that it was kind of navel gazing, that I was worried I was using her crime or the murder as a vehicle for telling my own story. And so I allowed myself in the early draft to put as much of myself as I think felt possibly necessary, because I do think so much of the motor of the book is this kind of alchemical bond I have with Jane Britton. But once it was in there, you could sort of see immediately what needed to be carved out. And I think, like, the parts of me that remain are me as the investigative journalist kind of piecing this all together, but also me as the kind of bridge between 1969 and now. And I think, without me as a character, you don't get the sense of how this story has remained alive, not only with the people who cared about Jane, but also within the Harvard community. And I think to get the sense of what has changed and what hasn't, I needed to sort of exist to be this kind of person through whom the dislocation of time could exist.
Mm-hmm. I think you did a really nice job, revealing your humanity in the process, and, moments when you felt like things were being revealed to you about your own experience or about your own relationships just by the more you were learning about Jane. In particular, I really loved just this part where when you were on message boards, because I guess to me, when I think of, like, true crime amateur sleuths, I think of these messaging boards, and, like, it sounds exactly like what I would expect, which is just, like, a whole lot of speculation and just, like, building and building and building and layers and layers and layers. How did you navigate the fact and the rumor and the whole mess of it?
Yeah, I mean, it was hard, and I think part of it was allowing myself to be momentarily convinced by the speculation on these boards, where I think there's a sort of suspension of disbelief that's important to say, all right, if you believe this, why do you believe it? And then spend the next however long it took me trying to, like, find corroborating evidence or find people to track down and call and say, people are saying this about you. Is this true? I think really fundamentally, one of the ways I kind of navigated out of the morass was just by talking to dozens and dozens and dozens of people, and by compiling these kind of huge documents where I would try to triangulate an event. And if, you know, there was never a threshold number, but like if 5 people agreed that something happened and I could kind of check their memories against other things that were verifiable, I could kind of understand. I think a journalist is constantly trying to assess how reliable is this narrator? How much do they embroider? How willing are they to say they don't remember? And like through that calculus, you can kind of understand how much you can trust something. And then I think, you know, toward the end of working on the book, I finally, after 2 years of begging the Middlesex DA and filing public information, you know, request after one after another, I finally did get the police files. And that to me, you know, thank everything that it came out before the book was finished, because I was able then to do even more kind of ferreting to see who was really trustworthy, and to have, like, you know, within documents, what facts I could rely on. Yeah, I think that was probably the part of the research that helped me navigate it. And then finally, hiring a fact checker was just essential to this book, because, you know, I think in many cases there's a kind of, it necessitates a moral arbiter. Because, you know, for one instance in the book, there's a character named Carl, who I briefly introduced in that reading, who is the kind of, he has the mysterious aristocratic air. And graduate students, he was at Harvard for 50 years, would talk about him wearing a cape and stalking the halls as if he were Count Dracula. And people would talk about this with utter certainty. And if I were just relying on corroboration, like, you know, 15 people told me he did this. But when I asked the recent graduate students if they had ever seen it, they said no, but, you know, graduate students before me had seen it. And when I traced it all the way back, it turned out nobody had actually seen it. And even though Carl himself admitted that he did own a cape, he said that he never wore it to the museum. And I just thought this one graduate student from the 60s was so spot on when I asked her, and she said, no, I've never seen it myself, but it's so believable that it might as well be true. Mm-hmm. And I think that slippage of truth into myth, especially for someone who's larger than life like Carl, especially when it's, you know, adjacent to a murder, like, I think it escalates to the point where people have trouble separating the two. And so it was just like as much diligent reporting as I possibly could to kind of figure out which way was up.
I would love to just talk about Jane. I mean, you're right that this is like a biography of her. You get to know her on such an intimate level, as much as it is possible to say that you can get to know her, I guess. What did you connect with about her? You know, and kind of the other side of that, what about her story did you struggle to fit into the story that you were writing about her?
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard. I've tried very hard to reconstruct what it was that drew me to her on the first night. So after the kind of order operations, I hear the story in 2009. It's told to me as this kind of ghost story. A year later, it gets corroborated by somebody else in the department who says, oh, no, it's a true story. And this advisor that you're talking about, like, he's still on faculty. And so that drives me, after I kind of refile it in my brain from fable into this like terrible open secret that people need to be taken seriously. I try to find everything I can, because as much detail as people seem to know about the case, like they're for blankets and red ochre and whatnot, like, they don't know her name. And so I've looked back into the newspapers that I was looking at that night, and I don't know how I knew, but there's this I felt this like irrational bond with her, where I could sense that she, and this sort of bore out over time, had this, you know, crystalline aspect to her personality where she only showed one facet of herself to anyone at any given time. And that, you know, for as ambitious and witty and even sometimes caustic as she was, there was this incredible loneliness in her, and this desire to be loved. And I think that combination, where she was, I think in some ways people would applaud her for her ambition, especially in such a male-dominated field, but at the same time, she was consistently told that she was too much. And I think I, like many women, can relate to that kind of duality, where you're rewarded for it in one aspect of your life and kind of chastised for it in another. And I think trying to understand how she navigated that really made her feel like a very close friend to me and a kind of companion as I write in the book in my loneliness.
You know, she navigates these things in such a way that, and you describe how she handles it, not always gracefully, but like, you know, unflappably, really. I mean, no, not even unflappably. She has moments when she's afraid or when she's tired and beaten down, and you share all of that, and in that way she becomes so much more of a hero than you know, someone who is myth-like in their ability to like take down the system or something. It's just really wonderful how you do that. And I just wanted to share one of my favorite quotes that one of my favorite things you wrote about her was that in Jane's duality, I felt like my version of femininity finally had room to breathe. Yeah. But like that's a really wonderful example of how you wove in a little bit of your own impression, but really it just reflected more on your subject.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I've talked to other people who've written biographies, whether this kind of blurring of boundaries between yourself and the other person is a kind of necessary act of writing a biography. And I think it depends on the person. But for me, there was this, because the person I asked said no, basically. It was Ron Chernow. He was like, I don't see myself in Alexander Hamilton. But like, but I couldn't for a while really tell where I started and she ended. And you know, I'm reminded of the Elena Ferrante books where, you know, Lilla is one of her kind of essential fears is the moment where there's a dissolution of boundaries between herself and the world and everything kind of shimmers at the edges. And that was kind of my experience with Jane. And I think what was truly surreal was that her friends also saw it too. And so it was either not only in my head or everyone was projecting the same thing. And so I think part of writing the book too was a kind of self-reflexiveness about how much was I just desiring her to be like me, and how much of her complexity could I allow myself to explore.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about Harvard, because part of like one of the really tantalizing sort of parts of the like elevator pitch for this book is that, you know, was it a Harvard cover-up? But really though, is there anything more, I don't know, terrifying, but like just, it's such a boys club, such a monolith. It is kind of its own myth in many ways. Mm-hmm. Tell us about your relationship with Harvard, what it was like in the 60s versus today. Just take us into that world.
Sure. You know, I sometimes, when I narrate my own experience for Harvard, I sometimes forget that during pre-Frosh weekend, so like, you know, when you've been admitted and you can kind of see if you want to go there, I, you know, hadn't really found my group yet. My host had sort of pulled me aside and said, have you committed to Harvard yet? And I said, no. And they're like, whatever you do, save yourself, don't come here. This was the worst decision I ever made. And I was sort of determined to like figure out a way to maybe make it work. And I remember seeing the kind of New York and European group of freshmen having already coalesced. And I was sort of standing on the side of it. And this guy turns to me and my friend, and he asks, you know, where'd you grow up? And we said New York, which was a fine enough answer. And where'd you go to school? And I said the name of my public school, which I wasn't ideal in his mind, but was fine enough. And he says, oh, do you know this person who had gone to my high school? And I said, yes. And he said, how well? And I said, well, he was my first boyfriend. And he literally looks me up and down and he says, you? And in that moment, I'm reminded a lot of the quote of Peter Panchi in the book, who says, you know, just because you're invited doesn't mean you belong. Mm-hmm. And that memory, I think, was suppressed for so long under my experience at Harvard for the 4 years that I was an undergrad there, where like, that seemed to me like the exception. I had the most magical time there where people really didn't seem to care about the fact that I was on full financial aid. You know, they didn't care more than, you know, who I was and my personality, and it was fine. And so I also happened to be in literature, which was this, you know, very female dominated field. And it was this kind of blissful experience. But coming back to Harvard, because I moved back for 3 years to work on Jane's story, was this kind of incredible opportunity to re-see all the stuff that I had been kind of blinded by the first go around, because Harvard is also seductive. You know, you get sort of sucked in by the baked brie and the sherry, and you want to get into every like room in the castle, and you sort of don't ask enough questions because you want to be a part of it. You want to be accepted. You want to be invited. And I think the surprising part to me about working on Jane's story was both, you know, we had always kind of learned that Harvard and Radcliffe, the sister school, had merged so late in Harvard's history, and isn't that abominable? But, you know, in the treatment of Harvard, of women at Harvard in the 60s, you know, there was one graduate student who told me that her advisor, when he found out that she was getting married, tried to revoke her National Science Foundation funding. Or even into the 80s, somebody told me that when she confronted this professor about the lack of tenured female professors in archaeology, he said, well, for a woman to be good enough for Harvard, she'd have to not be a woman. But that all to me sort of felt like the distant past. Mm-hmm. And there was this kind of, you know, I'd come in the same year that Drew Faust, the first female president of Harvard, had been elected in. There was this sort of sense that that was the long before. And so I think to have worked on Jane's story and to be asking these questions about academia and about women's experience in the department, the big surprise to me was kind of how little had changed, that maybe things were less overt. But, you know, if you look at the dropout rate, for example, of women in the anthropology department, in the last 30 years of all the dropouts or the withdrawals, 87% were women. And so there's really something going wrong there. And so I think for me, that kind of, I stopped seeing Harvard and academia in general as this kind of utopian place of pursuit of knowledge. And instead, it really struck me as a kind of feudal society in which especially vulnerable graduate students or adjunct and junior professors are kind of beholden to the senior faculty, and they really have very little recourse and very little mechanisms for defending themselves because they are enmeshed with the very systems that they would be protesting against.
Digging deeper into Harvard, I want to talk about the archaeology department, but even just the world of archaeology, which is so fascinating. You know, the archaeology professor and this, you know, major suspect, Carl, who you talked about earlier, like he definitely looms large over this department, or, you know, this rumor in the department. But the whole system is just layered and political and just what you want for a tantalizing story. But also, like, archaeology's, it's sexy. It's Indiana Jones. So I tell us about Harvard's archaeology world, you know, the myths and truths surrounding it.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think I was telling you earlier that one of Harvard's favorite stories about itself is that Samuel Lorthrop, who worked in the Peabody Harvard's anthropology department or museum, was the inspiration for Indiana Jones. But like a lot of Harvard stories, it likes to think it about itself, and when you look sort of deeper, it's probably not true. You know, I think a lot of, you know, the main rumor, the main myth that really drew me to the anthropology department was the rumor that was told as if it were an open secret, that this graduate student had died in the 1960s, and that, you know, it was because she had had an affair with her advisor during their dig in Iran. And, you know, when they came back, she refused to give it up, and he couldn't have this affair continue, and killed her in her apartment and dragged her back to the Peabody Museum. And spread, you know, red ochre on her, and had all these other ritual elements at the scene that made it point to, if not him, then at least somebody within the anthropology department. And it was such an alive rumor within this community, and it was kind of perfect because, you know, as you say, that, like, there's all these venal politics, there's all these motives, like it's a perfect Agatha Christie construct where there's like a closed community, and it's like it had to have been one of us. So which one was it? You know, I think it stayed so alive that graduate students would pass the story down from one generation to the next, even to the point where they had a physical file full of newspaper clippings and other information on allegedly this professor and on the murder, that they would pass down from one to another, and there would be a keeper of the file, because they either really believed in it, or they believed in it in a kind of an allegorical way, and whether or not anyone could sort of tell you honestly which one it was. that almost didn't matter. That was enough to keep perpetuating it forward.
I love how that ties into what you write about there being two different types of archaeologists, the scholars who are meticulous and all about their data, and then the storytellers like Carl. Another one of my favorite quotes, that all archaeology is the reenactment of past thoughts in the archaeologist's own mind. Oh my gosh. Tell us what that means. You also wrote that you think the storytellers always win. Do you feel that that's true still?
I mean, I think we have less and less room for nuance now. Where's the room in political discourse or even intellectual discourse for nuance and for, the really unsexy, rigorous work of scholarship? Like, I can tell you firsthand, it's a lot of flipping pages and a lot of cross-checking spreadsheets. Like, it's really not dynamic and it's not soundbitey. And I do worry that, there isn't the appetite for it, because even in academia, which you'd sort of think is sort of separate from it, think about all the fellowship grants that you have to write, or all of the proposals you have to do in order to get funding for your research. Even Richard Meadow, who is in the book as the kind of counter Carl figure, who is this extremely rigorous scholar. He says, science without a story is meaningless. You have to do it. And so I think the question is, how honest can you make the story and still have it be memorable? And, what do I mean by win? Do I mean like what the story that's remembered, the story that changes minds and culture? I worry that it isn't the story that's necessarily the most accurate if there's one that's more seductive. And so how do you make the honest one, the true one, as catchy?
Mm-hmm. Even after this book, I still romanticize the archaeology world. I don't think that's going to go away. But you went on a dig. Tell us about your own experience as an archaeologist.
I loved it. It was in Bulgaria. It was in this Chalcolithic site, so a Copper Age site. And it was the closest I could get to their digging around. There were no digs in around that I could go to as an American. And it was this kind of mounded site. And I loved it, even just thematically or metaphorically, where the past is literally layered on top of the present, which was sort of how I felt writing this book in general. But I don't know if there's any better feeling really than showing up. And, the dig director was so apologetic that the trench that I was going to be working in was like not clean, he said. But, to me, it was like a perfectly square trench. There were posts in it. It was even like plastic bagged on the side. I couldn't tell that there was anything wrong. And then over the course of the next sort of 3 to 5 days, I could suddenly see everything he was talking about. I think one of the most magical moments was seeing the shadow in this like 7,000-year-old clay and realizing that there was like a sort of darker bit of soil there because it had backfilled, that it was the absence of space from 7,000 years ago, or the absence of an object there, and that you could see the negatives of the past because it was slightly discolored. And so, the act of seeing something that had been in front of your eyes, but you couldn't sort of discern it at all before, felt to me like what I imagine being a detective actually feels like, or sort of like the most gratifying moments in the archive. And even though it was like over 100 degrees every day and I was dripping unglamorous globs of sweat, it was wonderful.
Show us your specimen.
I was doing a show and tell earlier. This wasn't from my dig. This is from Canada. This is Rama chert that I write about in the book. That is a very special kind of chert that is translucent, and is so prized that people would use it for making tools. And it figures very prominently in the book because there's another woman, another young, beautiful brunette archaeologist, brilliant, who disappears during her 2-person expedition to try to find the Rama chert quarry. And so, her sister tries to go back there to understand exactly what happened to her sister, because, how do you have closure if you don't have an answer? She doesn't even know whether to call it a death or a disappearance. And it's been 40 years now. And so she, like a lot of other people in the book, which I'm very grateful for, sort of understood that these artifacts are the links, the physical links that you have between two different time periods, and the kind of incandescent power that those objects have. And so she let me have one of them.
Wow. We have a question from the audience about research. Can anyone access police records in closed cases via public information requests?
Yes. So pretty much any police department. The only one that, in this story I couldn't access was the Harvard Police Department because it's considered a private institution. But yes, you can just file public records requests for state agencies, or if you want to do it for federal agencies, it's called a Freedom of Information Act request, and anyone can do it. They may take like 6 weeks to 2 years to get back to you. I finally got my response from the NSF after 2.5 years. But they are obligated to get back to you. And if they deny your request, you are allowed to appeal it and keep appealing it. And if you want to escalate it to a lawsuit, you can go all the way up.
I think something that we as readers of true crime really love about the genre is that perseverance, that doggedness of keep trying. And it's just clearly so required to see it through. Can you tell us about a moment when maybe you thought about giving up and how you got through that?
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 moments that I think come to mind. One is when I first started working at The New Yorker, and I was an editorial assistant, and it seemed like everyone there had the side project that they were working on. Mm-hmm. And I started to worry intensely that I was using Jane's story as a kind of prop, that it was something that I was performing to be something other than what I was. And so I dared myself to let it go for a month or 2, to just see what my life would be like without it. Because, I cared about Jane too much to turn her into something that I would sort of wield in favor of myself at a cocktail party. And I think I lasted about 3 weeks having put down her story and came crawling back to my journal. And I think I actually apologized to her in my journal. So that didn't last very long. I think the time that I came emotionally closest to putting it down was after I talked to her brother Boyd for the first time.
What a character.
Oh my God. He's amazing. He sort of opens as a kind of Holden Caulfield type where he's like, I'm not going to tell you anything about my family. And then he tells you everything about his family. Yeah. But I have such a soft spot for somebody who's, I think, so sentimental and so caring that they have to have such a kind of callous exterior to protect themselves. Or who's someone who's so loud and so performative in order to protect, the sort of softness of their personality. But so Boyd, part of his not being extremely vulnerable, at least immediately, is that, he did not mince words about his dead sister. And I was very unprepared for it. He said, she was manipulative and a bitch. What can I say? And I was both thrown off by his refusing to be the kind of grieving brother that I think you're taught to expect based on the sort of roles that we expect people to play from the media. And also because he forced me to confront that Jane, as I said before, was not me. That kind of blurring of boundaries reached its peak, I think, there, where he was like, no, you're talking about my sister. These are all of the aspects of her personality. She was imperfect in these ways. She, whatever. And in that was sort of stubbornly refusing to be me. Necessarily and obviously. And I think it just took me, I think I had to put down the book then for about 2 months and really come back to its foundations and sort of ask myself, was I willing to pursue this story and find any kind of personality for her, any kind of history? Carl in his first class talks about when Saudi Arabia commissioned archaeologists to kind of unearth their history, because so many of the countries around them have, the invention of writing, the history of agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. And the Saudi Arabian archaeologists came back with kind of nothing. And the Saudi Arabian government decommissioned the archaeologists because they had found a past they didn't want. And I needed to be honest with myself and say, would I be willing to pursue her story no matter what history I uncovered?
Well, I'm so glad you did. Thank you so much. I mean, after 10 years of investigating, it's just a monumental feat. And I'm just so delighted that everyone's going to get to be able to read it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for reading. Thanks for hosting this.